Hi. I think our time is limited, so I'll just start. Um, since I came here yesterday, it's been Turkey, Erdogan. It was refreshing to hear Trump once a while. So the two leaders that was constantly mentioned, especially yesterday, was Trump and Erdogan. And I just thought, wow, finally, we are in the American League. But of course, it's Turkey and the EU that are more closer, that may have a future together. And this is what we're going to discuss today with the light of what has been happening in Turkey, especially about the press freedom and the imprisoned journalists. So we have Emre Kızılkaya, who is from Hürriyet, Turkey's biggest daily newspaper. He's a content editor for the Hürriyet newspaper. Arne Lietz, member of the European Parliament from the SPD, and Murat Seyrek, who's based in Brussels, senior policy advisor at the European Foundation for Democracy, that is also the co-organizer of this panel now. And probably you may have seen or may have not, but yesterday the number of the arrested journalists behind bars in Turkey was 160. By the end of today, this number is likely to increase because another daily newspaper was raided by the police, and 4 of the journalists in the board, so far there's a warrant issue against them. We don't know what's going to happen today. And the question is Turkey drifting away from Europe, distancing itself with all the number of journalists in prison, when imprisoning and arresting journalists has become now a daily routine? What do you say, Emre?
Yes, this is obviously, is Turkey going in a good way or bad way? The answer is obvious, but in the details there are some interesting facts that we can discuss perhaps, because now in this discussion I think we are more or less stick to the European perspective, whether Turkey is moving away from the European values, democracy, human rights. Even in America, in the States, it's being discussed now. For instance, the Trump administration used a phrasing, something like American values when defining human rights. Although it's not just an American value, he presented it as an American value, and he said that we will not pursue it abroad in our foreign policy, which means that in our relations with other countries, it will solely be based on our interests, core national interests. And these core national interests are also in function, not only relations between the United States and the world, other countries like Turkey, but also between Turkey and its neighbors and European Union countries and Turkey as well. And that brings about a lot of problems. Especially nowadays we see problems like refugee crisis, migrant deal with Turkey and European Union, the visa-free issue, and with all these, only national interests are actually functioning between various states. So when we are talking about states, countries, they are, whatever they do, it's mostly about their own interests. It's something that we should keep in mind. This is the nature of the nation states. So good values like human rights, etc., are always used in their talks for certain reasons, but in the end, again, interests are what they are working for. That's why I especially give an importance to organizations like the International Press Institute, because it's a professional organization, a professional solidarity organization, one of the oldest ones in the world working for press freedoms. And I know that, for instance, in the 1960s, in the 1950s, the IPI was active in Turkey. There were Turkish journalists fighting for their own interest, which is free press. In the 60s, in the 50s, against an Islamist government, actually the predecessor of the current Turkish government. They were fighting to have a better democracy. And in the 60s, this time, this Islamist government was overthrown by a military junta. And these journalists were then fighting against these military leaders of the 1960s in Turkey. So what we should do, I think, especially as journalists, to increase this solidarity between ourselves, not the other issues, as I say, more or less ending up in core national interests.
You're talking about interests, and Martin Schulz very recently said after the referendum, Turkey is not only Erdogan, we have to see the other 50%. So it seems like 50% of the Turkish society, its interest is in line with the European Union, but there's another big 50%. So how is the European Union planning to deal with a 75 million, which only the 50% is in line with the European Union, and the rest is not, what it seems today, according to a European Union member?
Right, we don't know, because what is the European Union? We have different stakeholders. We have the European Commission, who has its own interests. We have the Parliament, which is aligning actually very close, and then we have the member states of the EU, which has the European Council. In that regard, I'm a member of the European Parliament, and I've been last May in Turkey. And after having seen and visited Cem Dündar in the Cumhuriyet, meeting the colleagues of Hurriyet, who have been very nervous already at that time, meeting people, academics who have been fired because they signed the peace paper, but also looking at how many media offices have been closed already. I called after having public conversations with the government and the parliament, and the week we have been there when the immunity was taken away by the parliamentarians itself. I called this country, coming from East Germany myself, is moving towards a dictatorship. So in that regard, I also called straightforward that it's not the interest of European parliamentarians, not my interest and the group I spoke for, that, for example, the visa liberalization you just mentioned would come across, because there has been an agreement, what has been certain steps being fulfilled, and if Turkey is not ready to take that steps, including also general issues like media questions, like public situations on human rights and so on, that would not mean that the visa liberalization is going to happen. Even the government presses for is having the big anniversary coming up. So in that regard, the European Parliament is dealing differently than the member states and the Council. The European Parliament called for freezing their talks to become a member of the European Union towards Turkey, but not stopping them. And so that is already a big step where we have not an agreement, not even myself, with Social Democratic Foreign Minister at that time, Steinmeier, now Gabriel, who are against that. So there is some conflict, even how you deal with Turkey. And if you have specific questions, I can answer them, but we might continue.
That's what I was going to ask you. Turkey needs to take some steps, and the nature of a negotiation is EU pushes and then Turkey takes steps. But does the EU still has any leverage over Turkey, and what should it do to push Turkey to solve its problems, again, within the framework of basic rights and press freedom?
Well, I think, first of all, the EU should start with, because we have been discussing also the fake news and the reality check, fact check, I think the EU should start with the fact check. Because EU used to have a leverage on Turkey. EU doesn't have that leverage anymore, but some EU leaders are still behaving as if the leverage is still there. So first of all, we need to understand that what EU can do is very limited, and we need to see how to use this power in a very strategic way so that the EU can still play a role in terms of democratization in Turkey and solving certain issues, including the media freedom. And secondly, I think it is very also clear that the language of like screaming, threatening, it doesn't work. Especially it doesn't work with President Erdogan, because if you start such a dialogue with him, you will lose. That's for sure. And especially this issue of freezing, suspending negotiations, I find it even a bit tragicomic, because de facto negotiations are frozen anyway. So what do we exactly freeze? It's not there. Government doesn't care, obviously, about negotiations. So threatening Turkey to stop the negotiations, indeed giving this wrong signal, because then you're indeed threatening the other 50% of Turkey who care about negotiations rather than the ones who doesn't care about negotiations. On the other hand, EU has tools and can develop those tools to use as a leverage. One of them is the customs union. As you know, Turkey and EU has a customs union agreement already more than 21 years, and Turkey would like to modernize it. European Commission already agreed that negotiations should start at some point. And And although this is about trade, I think nothing between Turkey and EU should be about trade and economy. And there as well, for example, issues about state of emergency, media freedom, jail journalists, they should be all put as benchmarks so that the EU can negotiate and make them part of the negotiation, which is very important for Turkey. And also maybe cooperate with partners like Council of Europe, because as you know, Council of Europe decided that Turkey is now under the monitoring procedure, which means that Turkey in a second league democracy with different countries like Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Albania, and obviously Turkish government is not happy about it. So it is another leverage point because government would like to get out of that list again. And for this, there will need to be some benchmarks, and the EU can cooperate with Council of Europe in order to address those.
Emre, you've been following Tayyip Erdoğan and Turkey for years as a journalist. So how does it resonate in Turkey? Does Turkey really care being out of that list and being closer to European Union countries, or did Turkey give up the European Union?
I think the orientation of Turkey is important. The big picture is important. The Turkish society, as I say, the interstate relations are based on these national interests, but societies, nations, people themselves, are they closing on to each other, or are they becoming more distant? If we look at the history, Turkey has been a part of the European system, the European international legal diplomatic system,
as well as holding the caliphate.
Since the early 19th century. And Turkey, the Turkish constitutional movement is from the early mid-19th century. And the first democratic organs, first democratic bodies were founded in Turkey in the late 19th century. So we are not talking about, for instance, the post-Soviet states that did not have those organs, those democratic institutions in the past. Turkey had these institutions, and Turkey was actually maturing into another kind of democracy, perhaps. But there had been so many interruptions of military coups that slowed it down, that sometimes completely destroyed those institutions. For instance, 1980 military coup was the most destructive one, because it was actually 1970s in Turkey was a decade that left-wing and right-wing militia were clashing in the streets. But when we look at the 1960 constitution, it was quite democratic. It paved the way for all kinds of free expression. And then, there was a chaos because there was no regulation over this, no democratic regulation over this, and it justified the coup in 1980. And
well,
since
today,
then,
what's happening today?
Yeah,
how would you define today?
Today starts with 1980 coup, because it destroyed all of these democratic institutions and replaced a military tutelage system. And this military tutelage system actually favored Islamist conservatives, which at that time Prime Minister Özal, with him it started. A right-wing Islamist ideology started to be the dominant ideology in Turkey, and the 70s Islamist movements morphed into something else in Turkey, and by winning the municipalities in the late 80s and early 90s, they paved the way for the AKP. But today's AKP is the product of this evolution. Actually, the AKP, with all its excesses now, even with these excesses, it's the most moderate version of all kinds of Islamist movements in Turkey. It's not the Muslim Brotherhood, it's not the Islamic State at all, or it's not any kind of jihadist movement, or the Pakistani kind of Islamism.
But jailed 160 journalists. So with all these problems today, one, what is EU planning? Does EU have a plan about those 160 journalists, that the number may increase? Or what's the EU's plan, next step for the negotiations? Because you're talking about freezing negotiations instead of proceeding.
Again, the EU has many partners or many bodies. I can speak for the European Parliament, what is going on there, what is going to be discussed. And we called to free the journalists in our own resolution. We brought up months ago already, after the coup, to call up every member to the media, and Kati Piri, she's a responsible person in the European Parliament writing the Turkey report. We are right now discussing in our committees. So we're coming up to the next Turkey report, and please ask you to take an eye of that discussion and also what is coming out, because there we try to foresee, to set always a new landscape on issues we would like to take up by the Commission and by the member states, like the European Council. And so that is a major part of having fair trials, but also having freeing all the journalists. And particular now we have a big discussion. I'm also a German member of the European Parliament, so we're calling for our German journalists or German-Turkish journalists to be freed. We have a new state of the art, which is getting to a very harsh situation between Germany and Turkey, extending the question of German soldiers. We are might be taking out of Turkey, so that's in our extending discussion throughout, even going behind the media question. But for me, coming from East Germany, we have been having coverage from media, Western media. So my father could is saying more things in the dictatorship of East Germany. So therefore, I know how important it is that media is being supported, but also that we take media responses on other issues. Like on the last panel, there was a discussion, and we had a media person who took up media rights. His name is Mazen Darwish, which was on the previous panel. So I made a resolution in the European Parliament to free Mazen Darwish as an important stakeholder, with the support of Reporters Without Borders, with the Amnesty International, with other institutions like the Pen Club. And that is important. So the European Parliament urges and pushes urgencies. And so we are very keen on, in particular, journalists and free speech and free democratic issues, but also the free parliamentary work. As I mentioned before, we have had the very dramatic like situations now. Parliamentarians I met last May in Turkey in the summer in the European Parliament are now imprisoned in Turkey, and I've been trying to visit one of my colleagues, Dermitas, and 100 meters before we were blocked with people, soldiers, policemen with MPs. And so we see this threat. And whenever we go to Turkey, we also visit, for example, Cumhuriyet. Last time I visited Hurriyet as well. So that is so important. But we see that media is being pushed lower and lower and lower. And I come back to your point on the business part. I also foresee that Europe's biggest and strongest tool is the trade. Turkey relies on a good trade situation, particularly Erdogan. The business is going down. We have a difficult business environment and situation. So the European Parliament, the European Commission has a very strong tool in its hand, which is to which extent we deal. We have situations, and so therefore we should take that up and use that. Now it's in the discussion to which extent and where do we put the steps and make barriers and red lines, which we would like to be foreseen. And then I come up again on the question, it also matters if we deal with Turkey and if we are still in the negotiation, no matter what the Erdogan thinks, but also to our population, because it's European money. We are investing in the accession talks, we're giving already spending hundreds of millions for the infrastructure in the institutions to get ready to the European standards. And so that is money which is also invested. And so we have to also have here play to our constitutions, to our people we represent in the European Parliament. And for us, we actually urge as a parliament to not only take business questions first, but also taking up human rights questions first. So the opening of the chapters we called throughout the last years on Turkey, even things got rougher and rougher, to open up the chapters earlier on human rights, on media questions. So let's have that on the table and see where Turkey stands on that. But after the referendum, I really see a very dark situation. And as I called, we are moving towards a dictatorship. For me, I think the referendum now starts a dictatorship.
Well, maybe you can also change the direction of that money without freezing anything, because it's true that end of the referendum and the result of the referendum is a blow to democracy, but on the other hand, we have seen that despite all problems and irregularities, 49% of this country voted no. And that means that there are partners for EU, there are potential partners. Some of them are journalists, some of them are in society, the different democratic partners. So why not supporting them or creating mechanisms to support them in an easier way? Because everything is very, very bureaucratic at the moment, and especially for those journalists. Like many journalists, okay, in jail, but there are also journalists who lost their jobs. Or they're journalists, maybe they have their jobs because they created different like media platforms, YouTube channels, social media, but they don't earn money. So rather than maybe infrastructure projects, it's good time to support those people so that they can continue their job. So in a way, you would be supporting very directly indeed freedom of speech in the country, and you would be able to explain this to your voters as well, that what we are investing in Turkey is indeed for pro-European, pro-democratic people. So it's not very difficult, I think, to change the direction of that money.
Amir has a couple of things to say about this new media.
And while doing so, I was about to add that those people that should be supported should be real journalists, because we have a problem. The main problem, as I said, the states, relations between states, I don't really, it's not my area, so I won't comment, but relations between people, as I say, Turkey is not becoming less European at all. I mean, when you look at the big picture, 60% of Turkish young people voted against the constitutional amendments. Most of the big cities voted against. Almost all of the big cities, largest Turkish cities voted against. So the real European parts of Turkey, if you had visited, who did visit Turkey in the past 2 years? Anyone visited Turkey 2 years? 5? Yeah, six, 7 people. I won't count John. It's cheating. Who visited not last 2 years, but between 2000 and 2013, let's say. Many more people. And why? Because you see, for instance, this is from the New York Times in 2010. Turkey is now a vibrant, competitive democracy. Or foreign policy, 2011, a vibrant democracy, an example of reform in the region. Financial Times, a vibrant democracy led by Islam's equivalent to the Christian Democrats. New York Times, a template that effectively integrates Islam, democracy, and vibrant economics. Then what did really happen since 2011? In 2009, my newspaper, usually the largest newspaper in Turkey, was fined 2 billion euros. 2 billion euros. And it was just because of a corruption story. And the corruption story was about Germany, actually, because in Germany there was one Turkish Islamic organization which actually collected money, donations in Germany, and used it for its own interests in Turkey, connected with some government people, and that's why they fined, this tax fine came like that. So, and New York Times was writing this, Financial Times was writing this, because they were mostly so tied to their state interests. We were with the IPI, with other professional journalism organizations, we were fighting against this, but they were writing this. So when you are funding people, and now similar things happening, but the other way. And this time, another exaggeration that Turkey is a hell. I'm telling you, 60% of young Turks voted against Erdogan in this referendum. So it's not like that, it's not black and white. And especially Turkey had a trauma of this coup attempt in last July, that it was really, imagine that on the Brandenburg Gate one night you see tanks and soldiers are killing people. So we lived it. My newspaper was raided by these coup soldiers. They raided, I was working at night covering this coup night, and soldiers, one soldier started to shout, saying to other soldiers that do not hesitate to shoot. And they collected us and escorted us out of the building to stop our coverage. So after such a big trauma, for instance, in the first 1 month, 3 months, it is understandable that a lot of people will be arrested because, you know, it's normal. But the purge has come at a point that, for instance, this coup was organized obviously by Gülenists related to Fethullah Gülen, who is living in America. There are all the evidence. I have no doubt at all. Their followers were behind it, followers in the army especially. And then now the government is using again this as a pretext to arrest all the critical people, like it happened today. Sözcü newspaper, the largest secular opposition newspaper in Turkey, and its owner is now, there is an arrest warrant on him, and reporters are arrested already, 3 of them.
So Emre drew a picture where a coup attempt by an elderly man who lives in rural Pennsylvania, led by him, and then a government that is here imprisoning journalists every day. 75 million growing. Islam is also a concern in Turkey, although it's a Muslim country. Islam and Islamists is a concern in Turkey. Why does the EU, again I'm asking the EU question to you, want to have a common future with Turkey?
Well, first of all, it's interesting. I'm not that informed that I'm already convinced that this was the Gülen movement and what is behind the coup. So we are still discussing that, and we have not found a conclusion on that, to be straightforward on that as well. And Turkey has, as you mentioned, I think you all mentioned, looking at the younger generation, that this is a very modern generation. I've been many times in Istanbul, one of the most beautiful cities, and also like cultural-wise cities in the world. With a very interesting, promising young generation, looking at also at international situations. So it's not a closed-up society met in these big towns. So therefore, Turkey is in many dimensions a very important, also closed country to us. We have the biggest Turkish majorities or minorities outside Turkey, in particular in Germany and in the Netherlands. So we have a close relationship through the people who live here in the European Union and in Turkey. We have, in terms of trade, a good relationship both ways. Not only from Turkey, we also like our relationship to Turkey, and then we are also together in NATO. So that is another important part. Interestingly enough, NATO has been always said is not only a military question, but it's a community on values, and so the values are actually fading away on the Turkish side. So the question is, how do we deal with that? That is one of the big new questions in foreign policy for me. But besides that, yes, there were German soldiers supporting Turkey as well, on many bases to help out, and therefore we have this interaction, and Turkey is a neighbor, just a pure neighbor. We also rely on good neighbor situations. If you look at the threats and the development through our neighborhood, we should count on every country we are in peace with and support in the neighborhood situations. It's a part of the neighborhood policy in the European Union, where you look on many modules and many projects. One of the projects is also very simple but very important: environmental issues. Turkey and other countries who are not members of the European Union get a lot of support, also financial support, to come up with the standards if they're interested to reach these kind of standards. So I just come up with a whole full background. Maybe the last part, actually interesting. Now the new Trump administration, Trump congratulated the British for the Brexit. And actually it was the US who actually was very much in favor and always called on the European nation states and the European Union to include Turkey into the European family. So this shifting is also very critical and very difficult to take the transatlantic issue here as well. So just answering a few of the situations, and so I hope we come back to a certain extent to build up this situation, as we felt the same pain as many referendum results. People have been like, the half of the Turkish population is in favor of another state and on democracy and values. And so on every country who is believing in these issues, we are supporting worldwide. That's a part of our foreign policy.
And a month before the referendum in Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan called specifically Dutch Nazis. A week and 2 days before the referendum, there was an ad on the newspapers by, please remind me, say no, vote no. So how
German Publishers Association.
The German Publishers Association gave that. How does this resonate? Like, you're living in Brussels, you're trilingual, your life, you're speaking Turkish, English, and French. So how does this resonate here in Europe? Why would the German publishers give that ad to a Turkish newspaper when a president comes here, and uses the N-word, the Nazis. It's just, what kind of a tension does it create?
Well, I will connect it indeed to what Emre gave as an example, like how Western media was covering Turkey and how there was such a shift, and which is indeed valid for European politicians too. Like when you said that you're not convinced, I'm not surprised, for example, because European politicians have tendency to realize and to be convinced late, and usually too late, because it was the case for Erdogan too. Like back in 2003, European politicians were seeing Erdogan, and same with the media, like the hero of democracy. So now he is from hero to zero. And that time they were exaggerating, and now they are exaggerating in another extreme, because they created this image of Erdogan that he is the one responsible for all the bad things, and there's even an obsession about Erdogan. I mean, as you're here, maybe just to give an example about your party's chairman, indeed, Martin Schulz, the evolution, like, he was the one just few months after 2005, like when the accession negotiations started, hugging Erdogan in the European Parliament and calling him the hero of democracy, is bringing democracy to Turkey. And when we were claiming that, be careful, maybe there's something behind this, and maybe he has another plan, those politicians, and not only him, from different political parties, were saying that, oh, you're just part of the secular elite in Turkey, you don't want to see that an Islamist is succeeding, this guy is sincere about it, this guy is a real Democrat, and we will work with him, and you will see that he will make Turkey part of the EU. And now we have come to a point that now they are telling us that, oh, he's this and this and that, and why don't you call him, for example, dictator? Because maybe it's going in that way, but it is not a dictatorship, because, for example, even with the referendum, if in a country 49% can vote no, that means it's not a dictatorship, because in Russia, in some other countries that you compare Turkey, such referendum results are usually 90% to 10, not 49 to 51. So that means there's a hope. And that's the same thing with media and how media evolved, but also there's a bit of a counterproductive approach now. Like 2 days before, if German Publishers Association putting those ads to encourage people to vote for Turkey in Turkish newspapers, then you're just pouring indeed oil into those conspiracy theories that the West is campaigning against Erdogan, the West is against AKP, the government, and the opposition is supported by West financially and by all means. But it goes even beyond that, I think, because like also a day after the referendum, the main headline in all, I think, Western media was "the democracy is dead." And it is problematic from 2 points of view, I think. One, it is wrong, because I don't think democracy is dead. It is certainly damaged, and it's a big problem, but it is not true. And secondly, by doing that, and usually the people indeed voted 49%, the ones following the foreign media, you're indeed insulting them, and you're discouraging them, because they are there, they are very energetic, they feel like, okay, we made 49 and we can build on it. And then you open Western media, you see that democracy is dead in your country. Is it the thing you would like to see? So.
Sure. President Putin got standing ovation speaking at the German parliament, being foreseen as a promising person. Gerhard Schröder called him a pure Democrat. And so things changed. And I think it's not helpful to...
Things change, or maybe the vision of some politicians are not far enough to see that there's that danger behind certain things, so let's wait and see before calling someone Democrat. Or maybe some other people in that country may have a better understanding of that person or that political movement than us. In a naive way, we just see few reforms and then he's the hero.
Well, try again my idea I would like to say. Things changed, and that doesn't mean like what I would like to differentiate here, because you kind of broaden the situation that the European politicians are not taking a stand. You know, hugging Erdogan. Which year do you refer to? Which year do you refer to?
2005, but as late as 2012 too.
There you see, but there you see. I think, you know, that is bringing your attempt to say a hugging on 2005, where things were totally different. also, and now saying, and now you're not acting. You know, that doesn't help us. For me, I'm a politician since 2014. I visited Turkey. I looked through what I see, talking to the government, talking to the parliament, talking to the ombudsman, and then making clear that this is a disencouraging situation moving towards a dictatorship. Saying that as a member of the European Parliament in a public statement in Turkey last May is not a situation by hugging a situation. So just making that clear that politics is not being, as I've foreseen it by the European Parliament, being uncritical and kind of waiting until you're pushed to say something. No, we are very critical. You can look at Kati Piri, you can look at my agenda, you can look at what the parties bring up. Yes, there are different party lines, but the comparison to Putin, who got standing ovation as a promising figure for democracy. Now we're looking at a situation where you have an autocratic leader. And so we have to face that new developments, which have been very quick. It's like the Polish situation, where the Polish democracy also loses democratic issues. And it's not by calling in the German media that the Polish democracy is under big threat. It's not the question of discouraging the pro-European, pro-democratic situations of people, but to make quite clear that if there is a change in society, in the government, shifting, for example, kicking out the leadership of the media in Poland throughout the last 2 years. We have to face it and then call it up to. And I think it's very important to be as critical and to be exact on the time being, and doesn't help to kind of do this random things.
Just very quickly, I mean, my point was more about coming into conclusion very quickly and seeing things black and white. Because back in 2005, everyone who is supporting Erdogan in Turkey was seen as pro-democrat. And now, everyone who is against Erdogan is seen as pro-democrat. It wasn't true by then, it's not true now either. I mean, that's the point. Okay,
just make it very clear. It's not a question of black and white. I come from East Germany. I grew up in the 1,000 zones of gray. And so when we went to Turkey and go continuously meet colleagues also through our sister party, the CHP, the HDP, there's so many different sayings. The CHP also was not fully against taking away the immunity of the parliamentarians. So we even criticize our sister party full time that they are taking up their own democratic situation. So it's not a black and white situation. We even have several talks to all the parties we are visiting throughout the government, throughout the parties in Turkey. So that is really much more complicated also work we do, which is not black and white at all.
In the early 2000s, 2004, 2003, I was just in the first years of the AKP, I was harshly criticizing the AKP in my blog in English. And it was, you know, at that time in Turkey, there was not many English language blogs written from Turkey. That's why there were a lot of interest. And all the expats and a lot of European bloggers were lashing at me, saying that AKP is great, etc. Why? Because they were mostly misinformed by these newspapers like New York Times that were always praising. And the praises were like all misinformed. It was not based on any kind of data, like the economic miracle created by the AKP. There is no such thing. Turkish economy has been growing the same amount, like 4 or 5% in the past 20, 40 years. So there is no, or democratic reforms. There was no democratic reform. As you know, it had started in 1999, Helsinki summit, right? The Turkish accession process, actually, the negotiations. And then the AKP just inherited it from the previous government, just like it had inherited all the economic program. Actually, it was a restructuring of the whole economy because of the collapse of the 2000-2001. The AKP just adopted the same program. it did not do anything, but it got all the praise. Why? Because it was so cooperative with the Americans, with the European Unions in their first years. And then after they got enough power, they can get rid of all their opposition people, and they did not need anymore the European or American help. So the European Union and the Americans were like collaborators of all the crimes that had been committed by this party, unfortunately. And now I don't really accuse Erdogan, blame Erdogan because of that. Why? Because all politicians, if you give them power, they want more, of course. This is their job. Just today, on Salon magazine, American magazine, Salon, it writes, Donald Trump longs to lock up journalists, and sooner or later he's going to try it. He will try it, of course. If he will get this power, he will definitely try it, because politicians are like that, of course. Apart from good progressive parties like SPD, I really believe in a certain conspiracy among European conservatives who would like to see a more authoritarian Turkey because it's good for them politically. SPD is not in that spectrum, but you know, conservative parties, especially far-right parties, will be so, you know, it's very beneficial for them to have a more authoritarian Turkey. It's a great puppet that you can scare people and get some votes. That's why please just support the right journalists. I don't care about state relations, but pick the journalists who use the universal values of journalism in their work. And unfortunately, in many journalists that now fled Turkey, had to flee Turkey, half of them are unreliable, half of them are reliable, I can say. Half, I mean 50%, I don't have a scientific study for it, but this is what I see from abroad. And by the way, IPI, Turkish National Committee, I'm the deputy chair, the Turkish National Committee's deputy chairman, and our chairman is in jail. And the price that we pay in Turkey is based on these lies that were told for a decade, actually.
It brings us back to the arrested journalists. Actually, I want to ask you, and you as well, more journalists are in danger. We, again, journalists, thought that it was going to be Turkish journalists with Turkish passports only. Now there's a German journalist, Deniz Yücel, who is jailed. There's another one in the deportation center who had to be sent back to his country, France. He's French. Like about a week ago, he's illegally being kept in the deportation center. Before you come to Turkey, you really have to be aware that you may be deported, or you may be detained, or even now, with the Deniz Yücel example, you can be even arrested. So, yes, I know IPI is a solidarity group, but what can journalists separately as well do for the Turkish journalists? Because this is going to sooner or later somehow touch you. Maybe not you, maybe you're not covering Turkey, but you in general. So any ideas of what can be done for solidarity? Any ideas of how to cover news from Turkey? Just any creative idea that can be discussed, or if you want to raise, you know, we're more than pleased to listen. Because this is just, every day it's deteriorating. Every day it's visibly getting worse. A news pool, I don't know, I can make it up. A news pool, an intranet, internal intranet that people can use to pass. Do you want the Turkish journalists sometimes, if they would be willing to pass their stories to you as a secure way of publishing them? Would you like to work in cooperation with the Turkish journalists? We have so many unemployed Turkish journalists because the media changed hand in Turkey. One of the biggest media groups is owned by brother of the son-in-law of Erdogan. The son-in-law of Erdogan is the energy minister. This is the situation. Everybody in that big media mogul was fired, replaced by new groups. So during the previous session, when you were talking about let's train students, I had chills. Because who's going to train students? The journalists of the energy minister's newspaper. So, you know, there are so many unemployed journalists in Turkey who were doing a good job, who are still good journalists, trying to find ways, means, and they have to sustain a life. They have to make money too. They have to earn money to continue their lives. So there are projects that are trying to be in collaboration with the European groups. There are some fundings that the EU gives now, which is very hard to get. It takes lots of procedure. But if you have any ideas, any projects that can be done, because Turkey is also full of stories. So many stories in Turkey. I can make it more sexy. Refugee stories, Syria, Islamism, ISIS. It's all in Turkey. You know, if you want some juicy stuff, but it's happening.
Well, what we have, what I really like is that parliamentarians take partnering to people who are in prison or who are under threat. So you have a person to person, and also through the parliamentarians, they have their own blog, they have their own Facebook, they have their own Twitter. So I think building up, partnering journalists who are in Turkey, who are under threat, who are in prison, so finding journalists who announce them regularly on their blogs, on their articles, just on their social media is very important, and also kind of coming up with the progressive, because I've been actually looking at the referendum, being astounded how many people living in Germany supported the referendum, with a yes. And in that regard, there are also the others who are living in Germany. So how, if it's possible for the Russian media through Sputnik on a girl which should have been raped and was not raped, and there were thousands of people on the street, I wonder what can Turkish journalists do, bringing the critical Turkish majority or Turkish German society also on the streets, maybe supporting journalists, and so using the networks of the social media in particular towards their society groups in order to have some seeable, also visible groups being on the street, being in front of the Turkish embassy, maybe having also every month a day or every quarter of a year. You know, can always go stronger, but it has to have some results. So maybe to have continuously situations where things have been taken up and partnering with support, I think this is important.
Any questions? I think it's over. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
If anyone wants, just now I got the notification from Turkish newspapers that the secular Turkish newspaper Sözcü's reporter has just been detained. So there were more detentions, it seems. If you would like to come to the stage, perhaps we can pose for a photograph just to support Turkish journalists as IPI and all others. Like a group photo, would you like?